you are enjoying this series, as I think we all are, however, you will also want to thank tonight's speaker. He was definitely the power behind the throne here. When I give you a brief summary of his background, you will see why. Well, that and the fact that he's Ruth Wilson's husband. John Wilson, who was educated at Harvard and Union Theological Seminary, came to the Religion Department of Princeton in 1960. His tenure at Princeton has included, in addition to his teaching and scholarly work, serving as chair of the Religion Department, where last week's speaker was one of his graduate students, as the master of Forbes College, and for the 9 years preceding his retirement in 2003, he was dean of the graduate school. As a scholar, Professor Wilson specializes in American religious history. He is an authority on Jonathan Edwards. And clearly, in preparation for this series, he directed and was both an author and the editor of a long-term project on the church and state in American history. His topic tonight, Religion and Government in America, Living Under the Constitution, could not be more timely. So if you've been enjoying this wonderful series tonight, we have one of the people that you can thank for it. John.
Thank you for that warm welcome. I'm going to take my jacket off, if I may. It's hot in here. I wish I had brought along a PowerPoint presentation, which I think are elegant. I must admit I stepped out of the classroom before it became de rigueur for faculty members to make use of it. And I have not taken part of my retirement to catch up with it. And I felt a bit guilty about this until recently I heard the perfect excuse. I'm sure all of you are familiar with Lord Acton's wonderful dictum, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And indeed, I think that's as applicable to religion as it is to politics. So it could be the subtitle of this whole series. But I heard more recently a version of it, which at least gives me some reason for not feeling too guilty about failing to produce PowerPoint, and that is power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. I know there's an argument to be had there, and I propose we not get into it at this point. I've obviously known about this series as it has evolved, and I became a kind of movable player, a sixth person on the basketball team, so to speak. So I gave a title that was elastic enough to allow fitting in either early on or toward the end of the subsection dealing with things American. As I've thought about what might be useful, it seems to me there are 4 topics that I'd like to introduce, and I'll try to go through them in a way that suggests connections among them. But I'll tell you what they are up front. First, I think it's important to take a few minutes to look at the actual constitutional provision for religion. This is something we always make reference back to. The Constitution is the foundation of our liberties, and that it certainly is. But we very seldom look back at the actual words of the Constitution, and I want to do that briefly with you. And parenthetically, I hope you all have the handout where I've reproduced some of the critical texts, beginning with the texts in the Constitution proper. But then I want to move on to a second question, because we ask if the separation of church and state, or the wall of separation, doesn't appear in the Constitution, where did it come from? So let's look at that, and we'll find that it developed out of Thomas Jefferson's political career, and it got woven deeply into the fabric of American life in the 19th century and haunts us till this day. But then thirdly, I want to talk for a few minutes about something that's often called ethno-religious voting in the American two-party system. It's a vast topic and a murky topic, and I don't pretend that I can bring much illumination to it, but I would at least like to point you to it and hope that you'll think about it now and in the future. And finally, presuming this time, I want to spend just a few moments talking about a proposal first made some 4 decades ago, that there really was a discrete American civil religion, a religion of the American polity that lives among us and that we participate in, and comment about where that idea comes from and how we might think about it. So on to the actual Constitution and the provision for religion. The Constitution, of course, came about after the colonies become states that had waged a war of independence against Great Britain, decided that the Articles were too weak as a way of collaborating with each other. There were too many challenges to face, having to do with commerce, having to do with taxation, and so forth and so on. And so the Continental Congress suggested that a meeting take place which would consider how the Articles could be adjusted so as more effectively to serve the purposes of the new nation. That meeting took place in Annapolis, Maryland. Very few representatives attended, and it was in short order decided that a convention should be held in Philadelphia, what we know as the Constitutional Convention. And this, of course, having received a ball, ran with it. And meeting across the summer months in 1787, the Constitutional Convention met largely in secret. No records were kept of its deliberations, and really put together this quite remarkable document that has been our Constitution for now over 2 centuries. It was put together and carefully crafted. It was designed with great care for its assumptions and the way to achieve its goals, namely to create a republic of laws. It was based upon the separation of powers, the notion that power should not be concentrated, let alone concentrated absolutely, let alone in PowerPoint, and that the way to assure that the government would retain its freedom would be for these powers to be balanced against each other, particularly the 3 branches of government and the federal government over against the state governments. Now you might ask, well, what then was said in this quite remarkable convention about the place of religion in this new United States? And the answer is something was said. And if you look at your handout, Roman 1A, you'll be reminded that there is a kind of overlooked provision in the Constitution proper having to do with religion. And it's a kind of unequivocal statement. I'm not going to read it to you, but the whole thing to you, but the important point is, of course, in italics in what I've reproduced here. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Now, in talking about this matter subsequently in the ratifying conventions, not a few of the delegates who had been there said, this is clearly meant to say that the new government of the United States shall have nothing to do with religion. There shall be an independence between religion and government. And this, they thought, was the only clause needed to make that self-evident. Well, in the course of the constitutional draft going out to the various states to be reviewed in order to be ratified, because of course it had to be ratified in order to become operative, any number of questions were raised about all sorts of dimensions of the Constitution. Each state set up its own provisions for ratifying, and it's obvious there was some discussion between certain of the states because similar proposals appear if you read the records of the various conventions, various ratifying conventions. But on the whole, enough states agreed that they would accept the Constitution for it to become effective. But there was a kind of a moral understanding that enough issues had been raised that the first Congress ought to return to look again at the document and ask, how should it be further adjusted? How should it be amended? Now, the first Congress met, and indeed most of its first meeting was taken up in organizational matters, not surprisingly, and only toward the end of its session did Jamie Madison, who had had such a large role to play in the Constitution and its drafting proper, thought time had come to make good on this implicit process, to look again at the document. And so he took the work of the various conventions and found something on the order of 210 separate proposals which had been generated in these ratifying conventions. And he sought to weave them together, eliminating duplicates, finding ones that could be placed with each other harmoniously, and came into the first Congress with a set of something like 18 proposed amendments to the Constitution. Now, what's interesting, you will see under Roman I, B, and C, two of the provisions that Madison brought in to his fellow members of the first Congress. What's very interesting is that Madison's idea was, if you're going to revise the Constitution, you should go back into the document proper, and you should add new sections where they seemed called for. And so you'll see under B that he proposed adding to Article 1, Section 9. Now, Article 1, you know, concerns the Congress and the powers of Congress. He proposed adding this actually three-part provision. The civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal right of conscience be in any manner or in any pretext infringed. Well, that seems like a very full protection for religious liberty. But he also thought, coming out of these state ratifying conventions, that Article 4 required an addition. Now, Article 4 is an interesting, rather shorter article. It concerns the limitations the states take upon themselves if they're going to make this union work. And his proposal was here in 1C that no state shall violate the equal rights of conscience or the freedom of the press or trial by jury in criminal cases. So Madison's notion was the original Constitution ought to be opened up and these, among other provisions, inserted. Well, we all know what it's like to live in committees and with conventions, and the House took up Madison's proposals and decided that indeed any amendments should be added at the end as a group. They also decided there should be adjustment in wording here and there. And then the House passed its wording on to the Senate, and the Senate had its go at it. And of course, the Senate was very conscious of the fact that the states and state interests were represented in the Senate. So you began to get interests of the states intruding upon the kind of proposals that were under discussion. And then, of course, a committee of conference was required. And what eventually came out, of course, was 1D, what we know as Amendment 1. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. If you think a little bit about it, that rather compresses and squeezes some of the nuance, shall we say, out of what Madison had brought forward. And indeed, if one thinks about it, one can see the influence particularly of the northern states, where there was strong commitment to privileging one religious tradition. And they wanted to be sure that nothing could be done by this Congress to interfere with the privileges of their religious establishments. Well, this amendment then was one of, and this is, I think, an important point for symbolic reasons, but I want to emphasize it very, very strongly. 12 amendments were originally proposed and sent out to the states for ratification. Interestingly enough, this one, the one we know as 1, was number 3. Well, you may ask, what were the first 2 about? Well, the first 2 were about nuts and bolts. For example, the members of Congress couldn't raise their salaries while for the session in which they were sitting. Very commendable ideas, but scarcely deep metaphysical principles on which one found the rights of a new republic. Now, I make this point, and I'm a little sarcastic about it, because you will read many books and articles and hear many speeches talking about First Amendment freedoms as if it had been in the minds of the founders that these, and perhaps particularly the freedom of religion, had been so uppermost that it was put first in the sequence of amendments. Well, it was first by accident, by contingency only, and it doesn't in any way reflect, at least in the minds of the first Congress, a metaphysical priority. Well, I've gotten in one minor dig there. What should we make, then, of this document? Of course, the amendments were accepted, the Bill of Rights was accepted in 1791. Our initial Constitution, in a sense, was then completed. There's nothing here about separation of church and state, a high wall of separation. What there is the attempt to say there shall be an independence of government and religion. And I would want to go on to argue that's because, in part, religion and religious activities and religious institutions were seen as a kind of power source in the society, if you will. And that along with the balancing of state interests against the federal government, there went the balancing of the interests of government over against other social institutions. We could see the religious institutions here as kind of examples of what would begin to become a whole array of activities in American culture which balanced, at least in early years, the power accorded to the national government, the federal government. I've included here under Roman II an excerpt, it's a very brief excerpt, from a letter which Madison, and you gather from my comments how much I admire him, Madison wrote this to a man named Jasper Adams, who was president of the College of Charleston in South Carolina at the end of his life. Jasper Adams had written him a rather contentious letter in which he'd accused him of being party to a kind of disrespect for religion. And Madison writes this long and wonderful response, a very civil one, going back and reviewing the history of humankind and the arrangements that have been made for relations between politics and religion, and then summarizing in these few sentences what the resolution proposed by the Constitution was. And he said he must admit it's not possible in every case to trace the line of separation between the rights of religion and the civil authority with such distinction or distinctness, as to avoid collisions and doubts on unessential points. Well, if I had had my druthers, that's what we would have been talking about, rather than a wall of separation between church and state. But we did get this phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, and that's what I want to turn to as the next kind of exhibit. Where does that phrase come from? And how did it end up, so to speak, constitutionalized? Well, it comes from, initially, a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote while president to the group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, who had written him a letter expressing appreciation for his leadership and his commitment to respecting the rights of a conscience. Jefferson clearly took great pains in drafting this response. We know he consulted his attorney general, and it was drafted several times because Jefferson saw an opportunity here. Well, what was the opportunity? Here I'll jump ahead for just a minute to say, one of the failures of our founders was that they didn't recognize that parties would become such an important part of American political life. And already by the time of Jefferson, in effect, a two-party system had begun to emerge. One party being composed of the Federalists. These were the people of substance and land who by and large had run the states of the North and the South. They had been heavily represented in Congress, and they were, of course, they had been supporters of Washington, but they saw Jefferson as the great enemy. And Jefferson returned the compliments. He was already deeply imbued with notions coming from his reading as well as his period in France, loving the Enlightenment, convinced that humans were born to be free and independent and individual. And the Federalists he simply couldn't stomach. Of course, he and John Adams were a pair in sort of disliking each other very intensely throughout most of their lives, perhaps reconciling only at the end when they died on the same day. Jefferson saw this as an opportunity. It was an opportunity to encourage, I'm going to use a contemporary term, insurgents in the state of Connecticut, which was primarily run by Federalists. Here was a chance to encourage a party within Connecticut politics that would make trouble for the Federalists whom Jefferson loathed. So this letter was very carefully drafted, and drafted in such a way as to encourage these Baptists to give the Federalists a hard time. I've included here at the bottom of the first sheet Jefferson's letter to the Baptists. I'm not going to read it all. It's something that you probably know much better than any part of the Constitution proper, but it ends with the operative phrase, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Well, the fascinating thing about it is that having addressed Jefferson in almost a fawning way, actually a proper way in the early 19th century, and Jefferson having responded in this way, the Baptists then apparently ignored the response. In other words, there was something about it that even they didn't like. Perhaps their Federalist neighbors had leaned on them rather hard. So in a sense, the letter simply drops out of sight, although it's well known and it continues in play as during the first half of the 19th century, party differences continue to form. We'll say a little bit more about that later. And Jefferson's phrase, wall of separation, in a sense, takes on a life as a way for people to argue that, for their own purposes, religion and government ought to be kept apart. Now, why do I say for their own purposes? Typically, this phrase was picked up by the Protestants, increasingly evangelical Protestants. Remember now, public schools are beginning to form, and the question, should there be religious exercises in the classroom, prayers, Bible reading, and so forth and so on? The Protestants were eager to push the King James Version of the Bible as the one from which reading should be given, and prayers, appropriately Protestant prayers, were obviously thought to be suitable for the classroom. Whereas increasing numbers of new Americans, many of them from Catholic lands, felt this was the imposition of a kind of Protestant establishment on them. Now, the Protestants used Jefferson's wall of separation metaphor, in a sense, to hide behind as they tried to create a semi-public culture, which in fact was experienced as oppressive by many, certainly by many, many Catholics, and certainly by some of the Jews who were migrating at the same time. That still doesn't explain, however, how this phrase comes into American law. That's how it comes into the political life of Americans, into the political culture. And that we'll say a bit more about in a minute. It comes in through a very interesting case. I think You're all aware that among the conflicts of the 19th century following the Civil War, the question of how the Mormons should be dealt with in Utah becomes a very salient issue. The Mormons had, of course, developed, beginning in New York State, moving to the Midwest, and then on the basis of the death, the murder of their founder, Joseph Smith, relocating under Brigham Young to the Utah Territory, believing they were beyond reach of the federal government. They viewed themselves as now living in free land. Well, of course, it became a federal territory. And one of the things, as the Mormons sought to ask, how can we become a state on our own terms, one of the issues that came up was the practice of plural marriage or polygamy, which was widely known in the East and viewed as a very unfortunate aspect of the Mormon culture. Well, again, a very strong political issue. Eventually, Reynolds, who is an assistant in the church, Reynolds, who does indeed have several wives, is brought in a legal case which eventuates in the Supreme Court. You may ask, if you're thinking about this, well, how then does this get into a federal court if the federal government is prohibited from dealing with matters of religion? Well, it gets into the federal court because as a territory, the territories are governed by the federal government. So it comes into the federal legal system and indeed is decided in 1879. And if you turn your page over, I've given you just a snippet from the opinion written by the Chief Justice, Waite, in which he takes Jefferson's letter that we've been describing and appropriates it, and in a sense takes it as an exact description of what was intended by the drafters of the Constitution. Congress was deprived, he says, of all legislative power over mere opinion, but was left free to reach actions which were in violation of social duties or subversive of good order. Here is the belief-action distinction which works its way from here into American law in other respects, such as free speech, but it's entirely based on the Jeffersonian moral of separation as being given, in effect, the status of privileged interpretation of what the founders had intended. Well, the story doesn't really stop there. The story has to go on because nothing really happens following from Reynolds. It's not really until 1940 and then definitively 1947 that the Supreme Court in effect says these clauses in the First Amendment having to do with religion indeed bind governments more generally. How does this happen? Well, it happens through Amendment 14, and I've given you just a brief excerpt of that in Roman 4A. This was, of course, an amendment that followed the Civil War. The intention of it was to give equal rights to all citizens of the nation. And under this provision, a movement begins to take place to incorporate the rights of the Bill of Rights, particularly, incorporate them in the sense, meaning apply them to all other jurisdictions. This is done with free speech, for example. It's only in 1940, however, that the issue of how these religion clauses relate to other jurisdictions comes before the Supreme Court, and Justice Roberts, writing, in effect reaches back to Waite's decision in Reynolds v. United States, and the freedom of belief is in fact read into the Constitution. But really it's only in 1947, after World War II, that the full thrust of the religion clauses become operative as rights, as freedoms, which American citizens can look to. This is a case that has local interest. It actually arose in Ewing, down just north of Trenton. It had to do with a matter that arose during the Second World War when provision was made to reimburse the parents of children attending parochial school for the cost of bus transportation. And this worked its way up through the court system, finally reaching the Supreme Court only well after the conclusion of the war. And Justice Black, who wrote the opinion, really, if you take the time to read this full paragraph, simply takes the Jeffersonian wall, builds it higher, fleshes it out, and declares that this was the wall of separation that was erected by the founders between church and state, between religion and political institutions. It's a very interesting case in a number of levels. The actual outcome of the case was contrary to the rhetoric of the wall, was to say, yes, the parents should be reimbursed for the bus fares they had expended. But of course, what Justice Black's opinion did was to lay the foundation for what has been a 60-year period of intense litigation concerning what are the rights that flow to Americans with respect to religion in their common life. A number of these decisions, of course, started with the schools, Bible reading, prayer in the schools, but then began to go beyond those easy questions, and indeed began to flow out into questions of religious displays on public property. Of course, menorahs were brought into this, as well as creches. Most recently, we've seen how the question of the place of the statue of the Ten Commandments in a courtroom was viewed as permissible or not. Beyond this, the interaction with other legal claims has been extraordinary, with drug laws in states, with historic preservation laws. It's a very interesting one. Is a religious congregation required not to amend in any way the fabric of its house of worship if it's been declared as a historically preserved site? It's a very interesting conflict of interests here, isn't it? Well, my comment on the whole thing is essentially that had Jefferson's high wall of separation between church and state not become operative, had we lived with something like Madison's much more felicitous understanding of the relationship between religion and politics, many of these issues would not have been drawn in the way they had been, and I think our rights would have been enhanced appreciably. So that's commentary from this person anyway. I'd like to turn now to the third of the four topics I suggested we should talk about. First, the Constitution proper, then the question of the wall of separation and where it came from. Now a very difficult question, something that's been called ethno-religious voting and the American two-party system. A very interesting book written many years ago now by a very distinguished sociologist, Seymour Martin Lipset, who was a very close student of American political behavior. An early book of his was called The First New Nation. And in it, Lipset took up the question, how did these 13 disparate colonies with different interests, in fact, to use language that we might use, how did a common culture become formed that would make possible the existence of this nation that we live in? And he concluded that, among other things, or he suggested that, this two-party system, which we take as fundamentally given in the American fabric, although, as I commented earlier, the founders had no sense for parties, let alone only two parties. And of course, most of the party systems that we know much about, for example, in Europe, are based on parliaments, where there's a multiplicity of parties. Where did we get our two-party system from? Well, I've already suggested the answer that Lipset, at least, began to come up with. He came up with the notion that the distinction between the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Jacksons, who eventually become the Democratic Party, the distinction was really rooted in the different, let's call them religious subcultures of those early years. That the Federalists essentially had been the supporters of the established churches, the churches that had had privilege, and that had gained the support of tax revenue. The other newer bodies, the Presbyterians, who were not established certainly, although they certainly were in Scotland, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists, and increasing numbers of other religious denominations on the Protestant side, not to say increasing numbers of Catholics, often broken into ethnic church groups, and certainly numbers of Jewish groups, also increasingly over time broken into somewhat different strands. These groups formed as opposition to the Federalists, who went on to become the Republicans. And so Lipset suggests that in a strange way there's a kind of division in a deep religious subculture which feeds and sustains our two-party system in the United States. Now, Lipset was no fool. He recognized that the connections between religious subcultures and outcomes was not simple. Yes, there were such things as block votings, religious groups voting as a block rather than splitting their votes. But he also wanted to point back to patterns of values that different groups subscribed to, which might be embedded in their religious lives, but which were not necessarily specifically voiced in religious terms. And he also wanted to insist that these values interpenetrated other aspects of social life, including, for example, class, status considerations, and certainly ethnicity. So now, half a century ago, Lipset proposed this very interesting analysis. He recognized there were some problems. What do you do with the South, the solid democratic South that had been, of course, largely Protestant, but after the Civil War, it turns democratic? Well, obviously the answer to that was the Southerners who had experienced defeat in the Civil War would have nothing to do with the party of Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans who had brought freedom to the slaves. He also sees a grand reconfiguration of elements that comes about really with FDR and the response to the New Deal. And in a way, although he turns back to this question in subsequent articles some years later, he recognized, or I think he recognized, that it sort of played out and didn't seem to connect with contemporary society. Well, it's interesting. Just the other day I read some commentary by a very distinguished contemporary historian who for many years, American historian, taught at UCLA for many years and finished his career teaching at Oxford, who indeed wanted to go back to that kind of analysis and suggest that there remains a kind of division in the culture at a deep level, not necessarily expressed explicitly in religious terms, but having to do with different views of human nature and human behavior. The one party insisting on individual responsibility, the other seeing great virtue in sustaining the fabric of a social world. Interestingly enough, in the last few days, we've seen these divergent opinions expressed very vigorously around the question of the Bear Stearns resolution. I was almost going to call it a bailout, but that's to prejudice the issue. In line with that, the moral argument that the people who bought into lousy mortgages should have to pay the penalty for it. That argument, calling for individual responsibility, lines up on one side of this division of the culture that Dan Walker Hart was talking about, as opposed to those who are more concerned about the common good and instruments of the common good. Howe, in his brief discussion of this matter, is convinced there's something there. He sees it asserting itself in different ways in different times. It's dynamic and it's shifting. My argument is not so much to try to convince you there's a deep sub-religious divide in the culture as to indicate that it's at that level that one has to begin to think about the relationship between religious movements and political entities. Certainly the two-party system is a very interesting part of American life, and that it contributed, this distinction contributed to its founding and has continued to sustain it, I think has some considerable merit to it. Well, let me turn to the last topic because I see the clock is just about said I should be quiet and ask for questions. The fourth topic I wanted to address was that of civil religion. Is there a specific religion centered on the American nation? This, of course, is a very ancient notion. Think of the pharaohs of Egypt, who were divine figures. Think of the Roman emperors, to whom tribute was brought. Think of the divine right of kings and even queens, and such were rulers. This was a kind of idea that Rousseau, in his ruminations about modern cultures, Rousseau picked up and argued that republics needed some kind of means of attachment to the commonweal if they were to survive politically. Now, all this is very abstract. I would go on to say that I think in our lifetimes, we've seen regimes that have very explicitly built themselves upon something like a civil religion. I'm thinking of the Afrikaners regime in South Africa, for example, or I'm thinking of Sukarno's regime in Indonesia. But it's very interesting that 40 years ago, an American sociologist, a distinguished American sociologist, wrote an essay that received a lot of attention called An American Civil Religion. His name was Robert Bellah. He taught for a long time at the University of California, Berkeley, and indeed in his career ranged widely through history and over cultures. He was writing in the mid-60s as America was engaged in that terribly prolonged and agonizing conflict in Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War. And Bellah was particularly concerned, I think, about the number of young people he saw who couldn't believe their country was sending them off to be part of this terrible, terrible tragedy in Southeast Asia. And so Bellah wrote this essay, which is a very compelling thing to read, in which he argued that, indeed, there was a better America that these disaffected youth could look to. It was a better America which he thought one might view as having a religion or a religious expression. It had its great outsized figures in a George Washington or an Abraham Lincoln. It had its ideology, the ideology that Lincoln perhaps expressed most poignantly in his phrase, the new birth of freedom. It had its ceremonies having to do with the political realm. It had its sacred places, Gettysburg, Constitution Hall in Philadelphia. What about George Washington crossing the Delaware down here, just above Trenton, and so forth and so on. American geography is filled with these special locations where we say something particularly important occurred. And it had its calendar. It construed time in such a way as to remind us all through holidays of who we are and what our obligations are. Now, Bellow went on to claim at the time that it was elaborate and well institutionalized. He was prepared to say that it was in effect another religion alongside ones we recognize so readily, such as versions of Judaism or Catholic Christianity or versions of Protestantism or Buddhist churches or whatever. He initially had claimed that it had that kind of well-institutionalized life. I think subsequently he drew back from that hard claim, that strong claim, and really was happier with a position which said something like, there are all these elements in our American political culture, and in periods of great crisis or stress, they do come together, they do function in a way that can only be called religious, and they do have the outcome, or they do have the effect of binding us together religiously as a people and a nation. And of course, in his view, the assassination of Kennedy was one such event, as was, in a sense, the opposition to the Vietnam conflict on the part of many of the younger friends with whom he was so sympathetic. I think it's an interesting concept. The journalists pick it up and you'll still see it all through the media because it has a kind of arresting quality, a special American religion. My own view is that the elements are there. They're there in, with, and under other religious traditions. They're there even independent of other religious traditions, and they do, in periods of crisis or stress, gel in ways that certainly make it seem like a compelling religious option. Well, that's perhaps enough for civil religion at the moment. In conclusion, let me just be very brief and say, in effect, I've been arguing that religion is a form of social power. Yes, soft power, if you will, but a form of social power. And it has a very complex interrelationship with politics. And nowhere is that more complex than in the United States. And we're not helped in dealing with this by this image of a high wall of separation, because we are told, or we think we are told, that these are such separate things. They shouldn't be associated with each other. Well, enough from this end. I hope I have some questions. Nancy, are you going to point to people or shall I? Yes.
Could I ask you to talk a bit more about the difference you see between Jefferson's concept of a wall of separation and the Madison line of separation? In the setting of, if you look not at the rhetoric of the Supreme Court opinion, but what the court did in so many of them, it certainly is indistinct in terms of how it finds.
Well, exactly. I think the court turned its back on the wall and, in fact, has been drawing that line of separation case by case. And it's been doing really quite a remarkable job of it, I think. I mean, I'm not a close student of all the decisions, but I've certainly worked through them. And yes, I think here and there I find mistakes, but on the whole, they've been tracing that line with great effectiveness. But in a sense, they were saddled by Justice Black with this high wall of separation imagery. And that provides a kind of a hurdle to get over in understanding what the court is actually doing. Now, and obviously, I've abridged a tremendous number of things here. One of the comments to make is that Justice Black, among other things, turns out to have been a member of the Ku Klux Klan and had his own complex past rooted in, of course, one of the interesting industries is studying the biographies of the members of the court, and what they bring to the court from their own experience and so forth and so on. Justice Black brought a particular suitcase of experiences that in a sense were expressed very strongly in that opinion. But I would just say, in effect, we've abandoned that rhetoric, but it's residual in the culture, and it keeps getting dragged out and used to hit people over the head if we don't agree with them. So I'm lamenting the rhetorical use of it. I'm not saying that the justices have failed to do what they really needed. Although my preference would have been that Madison's contemporaries didn't muck around with his proposals for amending the Constitution, and that these very finely crafted phrases of his had in fact been inserted in the document, where it would have been clear exactly what related to the powers of Congress, what related to the limitations the states took upon themselves. And I think we would be in a happier place today had that been the history of the Bill of Rights and its adoption. But this counterfactual speculation is a lot of fun. It doesn't actually do anything. Have I responded to your question? Yeah. Yes.
Would you say a word about how the founding fathers came to put on the coinage "In God We Trust" and still claim that they are separating church and state?
But you see, I'm suggesting they didn't see themselves as claiming they were separating church and state. They did all sorts of things. One of the things that Washington does as first president is to declare occasions on which they shall be fasting. Obviously, the houses of Congress, Supreme Court, begin with prayer. What was taken over here were ordinary activities of ordinary people in the late 18th century. And they weren't sort of using a litmus test of Jefferson's high wall of separation to ask whether this was right or not. They were behaving as ordinary people. But they were working under a constitution, which was reflecting in law this notion that religion and government should be independent of each other. So it's, you're right, the threads are very, very tangled. And all of us could wish they had been sorted out in ways that brought greater intellectual clarity. But that's not what the world of politics is like, as we know. And that's not what the world of religion is like either. Am I addressing you?
How would Jefferson have reacted to this coinage issue?
Well, it's interesting. Let me take not the coinage issue, but the issue of the days of fasting. He refused to name them. And he said he thought he could have, but he chose not to because he believed it was inappropriate for him as president to do it. So he was, in a sense, precisely acting out of his own deep convictions about these matters. And I'm a great admirer of Jefferson, though I think he had feet of clay, like all of us do, I think. And but I'm not trying to diminish his stature at all, but recognize that he was living at a particular time in history. Yes?
I had never heard that about the days of fasting. Are you saying that was the ordinary thing? People had days of fasting?
Well, there's a... How far back in history do you want to go? Suffice it to say that in the English Civil War period, there became a very frequent pattern that was promoted especially when the Puritan forces were in control, that called upon the Parliament, the Houses of Parliament, and called upon the kingdom to set aside days routinely often, but sometimes because there'd been a particularly great victory over the king, and therefore everything should come to a halt, and there should be thanksgiving expressed for this, because obviously the divine was held to be the author of the outcome on the battlefield, or conversely, the defeat. This tradition carries on in the New World. It carries on very strongly in New England. It even carries on to some degree in Virginia. It does not begin to carry on to the same degree in the middle colonies, where there's a greater diversity of religious populations. But this was one of the issues being fought over in those early years of the new nation. Whose culture is going to control what we do as a people? And the notion of, well, the Thanksgiving Proclamation is this living on in our time, except it gets converted to a regular annual thing, really only in the late 19th century. Until that time, the Thanksgivings had largely been occasioned by events. Even during the Civil War, this is happening. Does that help?
Right, so it was a religious thing.
Yeah, it was a religious thing, but tied to the politics of the time. It wasn't a separate religion. People stopped work. People in the English countryside were supposed to attend church. Now, of course, it was always embarrassing when the members of Parliament were discovered down in the local alehouse during these days. Much the same thing you find going on among the then members of Congress in the early years of the United States. Yes?
In several of these lectures, the concept that, the original concept of separation was thought of in order to protect religious practice, religious thought, religious institutions. In the last part of the 20th century, we started thinking of it more as a protection for civil government from undue influences of certain religious.
Yeah. Well, it's been a very mixed picture. In fact, I would argue that at the time of the new nation, there was more concern perhaps about the ability of religious institutions adversely to impact government than vice versa. Religion didn't need to be protected from government as much as government from religion, because religious institutions have, think a little bit about these 13, actually 14, with Vermont separated states, young states. In fact, many of the strongest ties between them and among them are ties on the part of religious groups. Religious groups fed by educational institutions that were training clergy, or fed by missionaries who were making their way around from colony to colony. So there was a tremendous fear that if one didn't keep religion out of the way of the federal government indeed would find it hard to function. Now, I think it's oscillated through American history, although with the emergence of another whole subject that obviously I didn't even touch upon, but with the emergence of something we can call the American state. What do I mean by that? I mean a comprehensive government, such as developed first, in a sense, in the Civil War period, both North and South. But then, again, with the Spanish-American War and World War I, and then certainly World War II, and it's never declined, there has been this sort of development of an extraordinarily complex governmental structure, well funded by taxes, and a sort of thing that deserves the name state. I've been trying to be very careful in using the word government, because the early language about American life was civil government and religious institutions. But with the development of the American state, you'll notice, if you think about the timing I suggested, that it seems to have been related in large part to conducting war, although surely there are other reasons too, such as the growth of commerce and the development of new technologies which require governmental supervision of one sort or another to one degree or another. So the American state is a new kind of thing in a way. And I don't think the American state has to worry a lot about threat from religion unless it's a threat from being taken over by a religious party, which would use its instruments for its purposes. So this is a very wavy line, I think, through American history. And I remember several of the references that you heard, and I would have wanted to introduce a qualification, but I didn't think it would have been helpful to do it at that point. Yes?
Didn't the government, in effect, sow the seeds of treason and along the lines you were speaking about when they gave special tax treatment to religious organizations?
Well, yes, I mean, this is exactly what happened with, of course, in colonial times. The northern colonies and the southern colonies both provided a tax basis for the favored or privileged religious group. And a tremendous amount of the struggle was whether other groups could get in and have some of that tax benefit or not. That's really what the Baptists wanted in Connecticut when Jefferson was writing about the high wall of separation. What they probably wanted was respect, that their consciences should be free, and some of the tax revenue for their religious operation. Now, of course, the development of the notion that religious institutions should not pay taxes is all tied up with all sorts of other nonprofit institutions. Or in the university, which benefits from not paying taxes. And Princeton has been very careful to say, yes, it will help the borough, but it's out of its free will. It's not because it can be taxed. It is an institution beyond taxation. The tax code is, and its bearing on religion, is a very complex question. And there's no question that that would be an instrument for disciplining religious groups that were held to be out of order. Scientology, just to name one that has been, whose exemption has been questioned, or benefiting through assisting them. But it's very interesting because the other side of the coin is what we've seen with the charitable choice movement to try to use religiously based social programs as a way of addressing broader social needs. Now, I wouldn't have said it had been a rousing success. It's very interesting to ask why that is, and I think the reason is that, in fact, along with tax dollars comes the necessity to account for those dollars and to report, in this case, to government how they are expended and for what purposes and so forth and so on. And suddenly, the independence and autonomy of religious organizations has been significantly compromised. And you know, that's the interesting thing about religion in America, that it's been funded once we got rid of established churches, and the latest was in the 1830s in New England. Once we got rid of religions based on public taxation, we reached a policy of religious institutions funding themselves voluntarily. And they have been tremendously effective and influential as voluntary institutions. Really a kind of a remarkable, shall we say, exhibit, for example, put over against European nations, where old churches and other groups are still depending upon, in effect, government subsidies for their operations. This whole issue of voluntarism is a very interesting thing in American history, and of course it works itself out in terms of philanthropy, systematic giving out of free will for causes. There's such an enormous part of American culture. And here we are in an institution which benefits so extraordinarily from exactly that kind of voluntary support. That's another whole lecture series. Nancy, I think,
This is the last one.
oh, good, yes.
Did the founding fathers make any distinction between separation of church as an institution of the state and God and state?
Well, I mean, in a way, that's the sort of issue that the whole civil religion discussion in modern times is pointing back to. I think that on the whole, the founding fathers, I haven't used the word secular all evening because it's a poisoned word. It's come to mean anti-religious, whereas in fact in origin it means worldly as opposed to otherworldly. They thought their republic was a worldly government. It was a government in this world, and that individuals and groups were free to look beyond this world if they wished for whatever purposes. And I don't think they saw the need to call upon a higher power for the purposes of their regulation of this world. But that founding group was an extraordinary group of people. And very, very quickly, such a high vision of a republic of laws, I think, eroded. And people began to say, the American nation is a special nation to a divinity. And manifest destiny. And a mission to free the world.
We are endowed by our Creator in certain
The inalienable rights, however. I mean, it was the rights that the Declaration of Independence talked about being endowed with, not a manifest destiny. Thank you.